sewing machine, a friend in need. If I didn't have my sewing machine, a wicked life I'd lead.
I want to talk to you today about the welt seam, which is this, and the welt, the open welt seam. Okay, they're basically the same seam. However, one you're going to do a basting stitch that you're going to take out, and the other, the welt seam, you're going to have a regular stitch that you leave in and then actually top stitch the seam. So in the open welt, you can see that there's basically a tuck here where the seam would be, and in the closed welt seam, it is finished, and it almost looks like it's a felled seam, flat felled seam. Okay, so we'll get started. What you're going to do with both of them would be to stitch your 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we'll take our 1/2 inch, and the only difference between the open welt and the closed welt seam is the fact that your first stitch will be a basting stitch for the open welt and a regular stitch for the flat welt. So we'll stitch regular stitch, and we'll do the welt seam. We're going to back stitch, and then we're stitching our 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now that we've done our 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to go back, flatten it out, and we want to push it all to one side. So we will iron this, and we'll push it all to one side. Okay? I'm not going to take the time to iron it, however, you should iron this all to one side. All right, that looks pretty flat. Next we want to do, we're going to top stitch. Now I usually use the width of my presser foot, but you want to use whatever you can do to make it nice and straight. So I use the side of my presser foot with the side of my seam allowance. So here's my seam allowance, and what I'm doing is top stitching right along the line here. All right, so I'm going to just come down with a regular stitch, lining up my top stitch, the side of my presser foot with the side of the seam. And that is the welt seam. And you can see that you have a nice straight line. Now if you were doing the open welt, the only thing different would be you would take out your basting stitch, which would be your first stitch here, and you would take this seam out. Then that would open the flap so that you have what we call an open welt, which looks like this, so that this would be able to open. And we have the welt, which is this, and the open welt, which is this, with this little flap.
If I didn't have my sewing machine, I'd have come to no good end. But a bob and a pedal, and wheel, the wheel by day. So by night I feel so weary that I